Kharkiv, February 2022. You're standing in your kitchen making breakfast for your kids. You've lived in this apartment for 11 years. The morning light is coming through the same window it always does. Your coffee is hot. Your children are arguing about something small and unimportant, the way children do when the world is still safe. By lunch, artillery shells are landing 3 blocks away. By dinner, the highway out of the city is gridlocked for 40 kilometers. You grab passports, 1 bag, and your children. You leave everything else behind. 6 months later, your apartment building doesn't exist. Same day, same planet. A farmer in New Zealand is walking his property 12,000 kilometers from the nearest conflict. His country hasn't fought a war on its own soil in living memory. His government has no military alliance dragging it into someone else's fight. His nation produces 5 of 7 essential food groups domestically. And on a small island on the western edge of Europe, a family in County Clare is sitting down to dinner. Outside their window, Atlantic waves are rolling in off the ocean. Their country has not fought in a single war in over 100 years, not one. While empires burned, while continents were divided by competing militaries, while cities were reduced to rubble across 4 consecutive decades of industrial-scale warfare, that island stayed out of all of it. Same planet, different coordinates. This isn't fiction. Ukraine. Before that, Syria. Before that, Yugoslavia. In each case, the pattern is the same. Nations positioned at geopolitical fault lines face risks that are structural, not moral. The people living inside those borders did not fail. The architecture around them did. In 2024, the Global Peace Index recorded 162,000 conflict deaths, the second highest toll in 30 years. 97 nations deteriorated in peace in a single year, the worst on record. And while all of that was happening, Iceland scored 17 consecutive years as the most peaceful nation on Earth. There are 6 places on this planet that have resisted every single year of global deterioration. 6 nations where geography, neutrality, and self-sufficiency created what I will call a survival architecture. A combination of geographic insulation, low offensive strategic value, caloric and energy redundancy, institutional continuity, and controlled alliance exposure. Stay with me, because your location is your first and most consequential variable. Not your stockpile, not your portfolio, your latitude and longitude. Before examining what works, it is worth being precise about what fails and why. Ukraine sits between 2 major power blocks. That positioning, not any moral failure of its people, made it a fault line. Syria sits at the geographic crossroads of competing regional empires. Yugoslavia sat at the seam of Cold War alliance boundaries. Ukraine, for example, imported approximately 40% of its natural gas from Russia prior to 2022. Instamies an energy dependency that compounded its structural vulnerability the moment the geopolitical relationship collapsed. When those structural pressures exceeded the capacity of institutions to contain them, the consequences were catastrophic. 370 cities in Ukraine damaged or destroyed. Syria's population reduced by displacement and death. Sarajevo, a cosmopolitan European city, under siege for 1,225 days. These are not anomalies. They are the predictable output of a specific structural condition. Nations at geopolitical intersections, integrated into competing alliance architectures, dependent on external supply chains. Understanding that pattern is the foundation of understanding what the 6 sanctuary nations built instead. The first has held the top spot on the Global Peace Index for 17 consecutive years. Iceland. Not a single year of deterioration since measurement began. 95% of electricity from renewables, 30% geothermal, 65% hydroelectric. When global petroleum markets face sustained disruption, Iceland's domestic energy system continues functioning independently. Here's what the rankings alone do not capture. Iceland is a NATO member with no standing armed forces, the only such member in the alliance. But the more precise framing matters here. Iceland is not without strategic value. It sits in the Geographic Gap, the critical North Atlantic naval corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, and hosts rotational U.S. military forces. What Iceland has achieved is low offensive military value combined with an energy infrastructure that requires no external inputs to sustain. The formula is not pure irrelevance. It is minimal target priority relative to the cost of engagement, combined with energy independence that no external disruption can touch. The limitation is food, cold climate, short growing season. Iceland trades energy abundance for food dependency on maritime imports. That trade holds until global shipping faces systemic disruption. Understanding that trade-off, honestly, is part of understanding what Iceland actually offers. New Zealand, not because of its geography alone, because of what that geography enables in terms of food production and strategic positioning. A 2024 study in Nature Food analyzed 186 countries. More than a third could not meet dietary needs for more than 2 of 7 essential food groups without imports. New Zealand satisfies 5 of 7. fruit and vegetables, meat, dairy, fish, and seafood. 5 million people producing a caloric surplus that most nations cannot match. Beef exports hit $1.5 billion in 2023. Dairy exports, $1.2 billion. That production exists beyond domestic consumption. When export markets contract, domestic supply expands. The honest complexity here is that New Zealand is not neutral in the intelligence sense. It is a Five Eyes member integrated into Western signals intelligence networks. That alignment matters for how it is perceived by strategic competitors, but geographic isolation lowers kinetic exposure significantly. 12,000 kilometers from the nearest major conflict theater, surrounded by ocean. The intelligence alignment and the geographic insulation operate on different dimensions, and in a world where the primary risk is physical destruction rather than intelligence compromise, the distance matters more than the affiliation. Switzerland. This is where policy becomes engineering, and engineering becomes institutional memory. 1815, Congress of Vienna. The great powers of Europe formally recognized Swiss permanent neutrality following the Napoleonic Wars. 210 years later, that recognition still holds. 2 world wars, the Cold War, the War on Terror, and the current European security crisis. Switzerland maintained neutrality through all of it, not through passivity, but through deliberate structural investment. 370,000 fallout shelters. Every citizen accounted for under federal law since 1963. Build a house, build a shelter in the basement. If construction is not possible, pay 1,400 Swiss francs per occupant into the public shelter fund. 2-ton reinforced doors. Ventilation systems engineered for 40-year operational life. Filtration capacity for nuclear fallout and chemical agents. In October 2025, the Swiss government authorized renovation of 200 civil protection shelters over 15 years at a budget of 235 million euros. Disused military bunkers were pulled from sale and placed into modernization programs instead. Switzerland also maintains 140,000 active military personnel with substantial reserves, not for force projection, but to make the cost of invasion prohibitively high for any rational actor. Constitutional neutrality backed by porcupine defense. That combination, political non-alignment plus sufficient defensive deterrence, is the most consistently validated survival architecture in European history. Argentina, the nation that controls food production, holds a structural advantage that no financial instrument can replicate. 57% of total exports are agri-food. Top 5 globally in beef, soybeans, wheat, corn, and dairy. A nation of 46 million people producing enough calories to feed itself approximately 3 times over. To understand what this means in practice, consider the mechanism. The Pampas, the vast central and eastern plains, contain some of the deepest, most fertile topsoil on Earth. This is not infrastructure that can be bombed into irrelevance or sanctioned into dysfunction. It is geology. Accumulated over millennia, it produces regardless of what happens to the peso, regardless of what happens to sovereign debt markets, regardless of what any government in Buenos Aires decides. When global supply chains face disruption, the Pampas do not stop producing. They simply redirect output inward. A population that cannot feed itself faces existential risk under sustained global disruption. A population sitting on a caloric surplus of that magnitude faces a different class of problem entirely. The honest limitation requires equally direct treatment. Food security prevents famine. It does not prevent financial collapse, and Argentina has experienced financial collapse repeatedly. The mechanism is documented precisely. In 2001, Argentina defaulted on $93 billion of sovereign debt, at the time the largest sovereign default in history. The government froze bank accounts, converted dollar deposits to pesos, then devalued the peso by 70% within months. Savers who held dollars in Argentine banks lost most of their dollar value overnight, not through war, not through physical destruction, but through institutional failure. The 2001 crisis produced social fracture, street protests, 5 presidents in 2 weeks, and a compression of living standards for millions of people who were never at risk of starvation. The peso has since lost over 99% of its value against the dollar across repeated devaluation cycles. That is not a statistical abstraction. That is what happens to savings, to contracts, to long-term planning inside a monetary framework that cannot maintain institutional discipline. That is the Argentine paradox, stated precisely. The most fundamental layer of resilience, caloric self-sufficiency, exists in extraordinary abundance. The institutional layer that converts that resilience into comprehensive security remains chronically unstable. Argentina belongs on this list because of what it can never lose. It does not belong at the top of this list because of what it has repeatedly failed to build. For someone evaluating where to position long-term assets or establish a family base, that distinction is the whole analysis. Chile. The geographic case here is straightforward, and the data supports it precisely. 4,200 kilometers north to south. Andes Mountains to the east, a natural barrier of a scale that makes conventional land invasion logistically prohibitive. Pacific Ocean to the west, Atacama Desert to the north, Patagonian ice fields to the south. Any military force attempting land access to Chile from the east would face terrain that no modern logistics chain has successfully managed at scale. In 2023 and 2024, Chile completed a comprehensive infrastructure resilience roadmap with the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Office. 6 critical sectors assessed. A resilience academy established with international experts. An integrated data hub consolidating risk information across sectors. Its 2022 climate change law embedded resilience into governance at the legislative level, not as aspiration, but as enforceable policy. The geographic isolation and the institutional investment are not separate assets. They reinforce each other. Nations that invest in resilience frameworks before they need them operate differently under pressure than nations that improvise. Ireland. And this entry requires the most careful examination of all 6, because on paper it should not qualify. 300 kilometers from the coast of one of the most powerful military states in Europe. A land border with a nation involved in nearly every major European conflict of the last 4 centuries, full membership of the European Union. By the criteria that make Iceland and New Zealand obvious choices, Ireland looks exposed. And yet, for over 100 years, it has not participated in a single war. Not one. While the continent it sits beside burned through 2 world wars, a Cold War, and a war on terror, Ireland remained outside all of it. This is not luck. It is not geography alone. It is a constitutionally embedded, democratically maintained policy of military non-participation that has been reaffirmed by every successive government across every political generation since independence. Understanding how that is possible, given Ireland's proximity to everything that makes other European nations vulnerable, is the most instructive case study on this list. Irish neutrality began as pragmatic calculation. When the Irish Free State won independence in 1922, it declared military non-participation immediately. A small new nation with no standing military, no industrial base, and a powerful neighbor that had occupied it for centuries had one viable survival strategy: remove itself from the target architecture entirely. But what happened over the following 100 years transformed that calculation into something more durable. The temporary policy of a newly independent state became national identity. It became constitutional principle. And crucially, it became a structural mechanism that makes military participation architecturally difficult rather than merely politically unlikely. That mechanism is the triple lock. For the Irish government to deploy more than 12 troops overseas, 3 conditions must simultaneously be satisfied. A United Nations Security Council mandate for the mission, approval by the Irish Cabinet, approval by the Irish Parliament, the Dáil Éireann. The first condition is the critical one. A UN Security Council mandate requires either unanimous approval or abstention among the 5 permanent members: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. The practical consequence is that Ireland cannot be committed to a military operation unless the international community has reached a level of consensus that the Security Council architecture requires. Compare that to the position of NATO members who carry treaty obligations that can activate based on alliance decisions rather than multilateral consensus. The triple lock is not a political preference. It is a structural constraint embedded in how Irish foreign policy operates. This was tested directly. When the Lisbon Treaty was submitted to the Irish people in 2008, they rejected it. One of the central concerns was military integration, the fear that deeper EU membership would erode Ireland's non-alignment. The Irish government returned to Brussels and negotiated written constitutional guarantees of Irish military neutrality, embedded those guarantees in the treaty text, and put the revised treaty back to the Irish people before ratification was possible. That sequence reveals something important. The Irish population understands what it has and applies democratic pressure to preserve it, but honest analysis requires acknowledging what Irish neutrality is not. Ireland allows U.S. military aircraft transit through Shannon Airport. Ireland is subject to EU Article 42.7, the Mutual Assistance Clause, though it negotiated significant protections. Neutrality in the 21st century is rarely absolute. It is managed exposure. Ireland has managed that exposure more carefully than almost any comparable nation, but the management is ongoing, not settled. The food dimension adds a layer that most analyses of Irish neutrality overlook entirely. Ireland's 5.2 million people produce a food surplus of extraordinary scale. Agri-food exports reached a record 19 billion euros in 2024. Dairy exports alone hit 6.3 billion euros, distributed to approximately 140 countries. Beef exports reached 3.1 billion euros. Ireland recorded a food trade surplus of 5.2 billion euros, exporting significantly more in food value than it imports. 76% of Ireland's land area is agricultural, 133,000 farms, a temperate climate that produces consistent grass growth year-round, which is the foundation of its dairy and beef production capacity. When export markets contract in a crisis scenario, the food currently leaving Ireland stays within it. The domestic supply position improves rather than deteriorates. For a population of 5.2 million with that production base, caloric self-sufficiency in a disrupted global system is achievable, in a way that most European nations, heavily dependent on imports, cannot replicate. The Global Peace Index has placed Ireland consistently in the top 5 most peaceful nations across 17 years of measurement. While 97 nations deteriorated in 2024 alone, Ireland's position has remained stable. 100 years of empirical validation across World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the War on Terror, and the current European security deterioration. The honest current tension is this: the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created genuine pressure on Irish neutrality from multiple directions, from European partners seeking greater defense integration, and from within Ireland itself, where debates about hybrid warfare, undersea cable vulnerability, and disinformation exposure have gained traction. Ireland has increased defense spending and signed limited cooperation agreements on undersea infrastructure. Some political voices are calling for triple lock reform. These are not trivial signals. Neutrality that is gradually eroded by incremental decisions is not the same as neutrality that is structurally intact. The trajectory of Irish defense policy over the next 5 years is a variable worth monitoring carefully by anyone using Ireland as part of a long-term positioning analysis. Step back from the individual cases and the shared architecture becomes visible. These 6 nations are not peaceful by accident, by weakness, or by geography alone. They have each, in different ways and through different mechanisms, built what can be defined as a survival architecture. Geographic insulation from primary conflict theaters, low offensive strategic value relative to the cost of engagement, caloric or energy redundancy that reduces external dependency, institutional continuity through democratic governance and rule of law, and controlled alliance exposure that avoids the entanglement costs of deep military integration without abandoning all security cooperation. Alliances deter conflict as often as they create entanglement. The trade-off is protection in exchange for shared exposure. What these 6 nations have done, each in their own way, is negotiate that trade-off differently, accepting less collective protection in exchange for less collective exposure. Over a century of empirical observation, that negotiation has produced better outcomes for their populations than the alternative. Here's the data point that contextualizes everything. The 25 most peaceful nations were 1% more peaceful in 2024 compared to 2008. The 25 least peaceful were 7.5% worse. The gap between stable and deteriorating is wider than at any point in the index's history, and the rate of divergence is increasing. 5 consecutive years of global decline. The question is not whether that trend continues. The data indicates it will. Consider what this means in personal terms. If you are 40 years old today, you have a reasonable expectation of 30 to 40 more years of adult decision-making. The Global Peace Index has been measuring national trajectories for 17 of those years. In that 17-year window, the divergence between stable and deteriorating nations has been consistent, measurable, and accelerating. The nations that were stable in 2008 are more stable today. The nations that were deteriorating in 2008 are significantly more deteriorated today. Trajectory, not current position, is what the data consistently rewards. If you currently live in a nation whose peace index score has deteriorated over the last decade, and the majority of nations have, that trajectory is not self-correcting. It compounds. The structural conditions that produce instability, geopolitical positioning, alliance entanglement, supply chain dependency, institutional fragility, do not resolve without deliberate intervention. They deepen. The 6 nations on this list did not become stable suddenly. They became stable through decades of accumulated structural decisions, geographic positioning, constitutional architecture, food and energy infrastructure, institutional investment. None of those decisions are available to make in a crisis. They are only available to make before one. The question is whether your current coordinates position you on the stable side of that widening gap. And if not, whether you have time and capacity to change them. The 6 coordinates. Iceland, energy independence and minimal target priority. 17 consecutive years at the top of the Global Peace Index. New Zealand, caloric self-sufficiency and hemispheric distance with an honest acknowledgement of intelligence alignment. 5 of 7 food groups. Switzerland, constitutional neutrality, engineered civilian infrastructure, and porcupine defense. 370,000 shelters. 210 years of validated non-participation. Argentina, agricultural dominance that provides caloric resilience within an institutional environment that remains volatile. Chile, geographic barriers that make land invasion logistically prohibitive, combined with an institutional resilience framework. Ireland, a century of managed neutrality under constitutional law, a food surplus of 5.2 billion euros, island geography on Europe's western periphery, and a structural mechanism that makes military commitment architecturally difficult. 6 nations, 6 different configurations of the same underlying framework. The empirical record across all 6, measured across decades and multiple conflict cycles, produces a consistent result. The family in Kharkiv did nothing wrong. They lived in a nation positioned at a structural fault line, in a region where great power competition had been building for years. What they lacked was not moral judgment, but time and option. The farmer in New Zealand still has both. The family in County Clare still has both. The Global Peace Index is publicly available. Your country's score is in it. The gap between where you are and where these 6 nations sit is a measurable distance. Geographic, institutional, and financial. Preparation is not prediction. You do not need to know when a crisis occurs to understand which structural positions survive them more consistently. That pattern is in the data. It has been in the data for 17 consecutive years. The only question that remains is whether you evaluate that gap while you still have the capacity to act on what you find. If this analysis was useful, if the framework of survival architecture rather than survival panic is the lens you want to develop further, subscribe and leave a comment with this. Of the 6 nations examined, which structural variable do you think is most transferable to your current situation? Geographic repositioning, institutional architecture, food and energy redundancy, or controlled alliance exposure? I read every comment. The answers consistently shape what this channel examines next. The coordinates exist. The data is public. The gap is measurable. What you do with that information is the only variable that remains open.